I knew something was wrong the moment the envelope showed up, looking too official to be routine, the kind of paper that tries to make your stomach drop before you even read it. The message wasn't subtle. The HOA wanted inside my home, and they wanted it on their terms, with the vote looming like a guillotine over every decision I made. I stood in my entryway, notice in hand, feeling that familiar mix of anger and disbelief that always comes with a new chapter of homeowners association drama. I wasn't behind on anything. I wasn't hiding anything. But the demand wasn't about a problem. It was about control. The notice claimed there was a compliance inspection scheduled, and it used a lot of words that sounded like permission but read like a threat. The tone was polite on the surface, yet it carried that implication that if I didn't cooperate, I'd regret it. I could practically hear the board president's voice in my head, the same tight smile she wore at meetings, the same way she would talk over anyone who asked a real question. I learned quickly in this neighborhood that the HOA didn't like questions. Questions meant receipts. Questions meant paper trails. Questions meant someone might notice the rules weren't being applied evenly. And the one person who loved uneven rules more than anyone was the board president, the woman who treated her clipboard like a crown. She wasn't technically my neighbor, but she behaved like she owned the street. Around here, people whispered about her like she was a storm system. When she set her sights on you, you felt it coming days before it hit. I had avoided her radar for a while by doing something radical. I stayed quiet, I kept my place tidy, and I didn't give her an excuse. That was my mistake. Silence made her bolder, not calmer. The first warning sign had been small. A casual comment delivered like a verdict when we crossed paths by the mailbox cluster. She had looked past me, through me, and then at my front windows, the way someone scans a display case. No greeting, no friendliness. Just the vibe of someone searching for a reason to be offended. A few days after that, I found a printed reminder taped to my door. Not a violation, not even a fine, just an educational note about keeping properties inspection ready at all times. It didn't name me, but it didn't have to. It was a shot across the bow. I took a picture of it, saved it, and filed it away. Then came the meeting notice about the upcoming vote. The agenda was short and vague, the kind that hides what it's really about behind bland titles. But there was one line that made my eyebrows lift. A proposed policy update on access and enforcement. It sounded harmless if you didn't understand how people like her worked. People like her loved policies because policies could be weaponized. I wasn't the only one who noticed. My next-door neighbor, the only person on the block who didn't flinch when HOA letters showed up, mentioned the same agenda item in passing. He had lived here long enough to recognize a power grab when he saw one. He wasn't loud about it, but he was steady. The kind of neighbor who reads documents before he throws them away. He asked if I'd gotten any new notices. I told him about the educational note and the sudden obsession with inspection readiness. His expression tightened in a way that said he'd seen this movie before. He didn't say much, but he didn't have to. He walked back to his house and returned with a folder so organized it made me feel both impressed and slightly embarrassed. Inside were old meeting agendas, excerpts from the governing documents, and previous rule changes highlighted and labeled. He didn't hand me a solution. He handed me a tool. That's when I realized this wasn't just my problem. This was an HOA pattern, and I was simply the next target. The next week, the real notice arrived. The one in the official envelope. The one that demanded entry. It cited authority without actually citing specifics, the way bullies do when they want you to assume they have the right to do whatever they want. It said the inspection was necessary to verify compliance with community standards. It said failure to cooperate could result in enforcement action. I stared at it and felt the heat rise in my face. Community standards. That phrase had become a magic spell in this neighborhood. Say it 3 times and the board president appeared, ready to punish you for existing slightly differently than she preferred. I forced myself to slow down. I reread the notice. I looked for the parts that mattered. Dates, times, demands, language. Then I did what I'd started doing the moment I realized this place could turn into an HOA nightmare. I documented everything. I took photos of the notice on my counter, then in my hand, then next to a piece of mail with a clear postmark so no one could claim I invented it. I saved the envelope. I wrote down the moment I opened it. I noted the phrasing that felt like a threat dressed up as a request. Then I opened my copy of the rules. I'm not going to pretend I enjoyed reading them. I didn't. They were dense and repetitive, full of sections that referenced other sections like a maze designed to exhaust you. But buried in those pages were the same things bullies always underestimate. Limits. The rules talked about maintenance standards and exterior appearance. They talked about common areas and access for repairs that involved shared systems. But nothing jumped out that gave the HOA broad permission to wander through my private space because a board president wanted a power move. I found a section that dealt with entry, and it wasn't the sweeping authority the notice implied. It was cautious. It was conditional. It made it clear that access wasn't casual. I highlighted that section and printed it. Evidence prop number 1. Not for drama. For defense. My next step was the simplest and most effective tactic in any dispute with people who thrive on intimidation. I asked them to put it in writing. Not an emotional email. Not a rant. A clean, polite message with certified questions. I didn't accuse them of anything. I didn't call anyone names. I just asked them to identify the specific rule that authorized interior entry, explain the reason for the inspection, and clarify who would be present and what areas they intended to access. I made the questions so straightforward that any reasonable person could answer them in a sentence. And I sent it in a way that couldn't be ignored. I learned quickly that the HOA loved phone calls and hallway conversations, because those left no trail. I wasn't giving them that. I wanted a record. I wanted their words. My neighbor nodded when I told him. He didn't cheer or celebrate. He just looked relieved, like someone watching me step onto solid ground instead of sinking into quicksand. Then, as if on cue, the board president made herself visible. She didn't come to my door. That would have been too direct. Instead, she appeared outside, lingering near the sidewalk with that performative posture she always wore, as if the neighborhood was her stage. She looked at my house like she was measuring it. I saw her through the window and felt that old instinct to retreat. Then I remembered the notice in my hand. This wasn't about my home. This was about making me feel watched. I didn't wave. I didn't hide. I simply kept doing what I was doing, letting her stand out there with her own theatrics. The next message from the HOA came fast, and it wasn't an answer. It was a vague response that thanked me for my inquiry and repeated that inspections were part of maintaining standards. It offered no citation, no policy, no limit. It simply restated the demand and suggested that refusing would be viewed as non-compliance. That's when the tension shifted from annoying to serious. Because a board that won't answer simple questions isn't trying to resolve anything. It's trying to test how far it can push. My neighbor suggested I look at the meeting agenda more closely. Not just the items listed, but the formatting, the language, the way it was presented. He pointed to the access and enforcement item again. He'd seen it before. Not the exact wording, but the strategy. If they could pass a new policy before the vote, they could retroactively justify what they were doing now. They could turn my refusal into a problem and then claim they needed to act because I made them. It was petty. It was procedural. And it was exactly the kind of trick that made people in this community give up. Not me. I requested the supporting documents for the agenda item. I asked for the draft language, the rationale, and the records of complaints or incidents that prompted it. Another certified set of questions. Another polite message. Another paper trail. Then I did something the board president didn't expect. I talked to other homeowners. Not a mob. Not a smear campaign. Just quiet conversations on walks, in driveways, while checking mail. I mentioned the agenda item. I mentioned the inspection demand. I asked if anyone had experienced similar pressure. At first, people were cautious. HOA politics makes people nervous. They don't want to be targeted. They don't want a note on their door. They don't want to be the next example. But something interesting happens when you ask a simple question in a calm voice. People start remembering. Someone mentioned they'd been pressured to allow a quick look inside after a minor exterior issue. Someone else recalled a board member dropping by unannounced to verify something. Someone mentioned a sudden burst of enforcement right before another vote. It wasn't just me. It was a pattern. And patterns are powerful, because they turn isolated fear into shared awareness. I kept my notes simple. I didn't write names. I didn't assign blame. I just tracked the theme and the timing. Then the HOA made the next move. Another notice arrived, more aggressive in tone, using more must language and less please. This one referenced inspection authority again, still without citing a specific rule. It also mentioned that the inspection would proceed as scheduled, implying that my consent was optional. That sentence landed like a slap. I sat at my kitchen table, notice spread out in front of me, and I felt my pulse thudding in my ears. This was the moment they wanted. The moment they expected me to panic, to lash out, to send something angry they could point to as proof I was difficult. Instead, I breathed. I took a photo. Evidence prop number 2. A dated notice with escalating language. Then I pulled up the HOA's own published policies. The ones they posted for residents to follow. The ones that talked about notice requirements and procedural fairness. And there it was, plain as day, a section about inspections that referenced exterior conditions and common areas, not unbounded interior access. I printed that too, highlighted, and clipped it behind the governing document excerpt. A small stack of paper, but it felt like armor. The rehook came naturally, because the stakes were no longer about a letter on my door. The stakes were about what they could do if they got away with this before the vote, and how quickly they could turn a private home into a stage for public embarrassment. I didn't want a shouting match. I wanted boundaries. And boundaries are built with records. So I prepared for the meeting like it mattered, because it did. I drafted a statement for myself, not to read dramatically, but to keep me grounded. I listed my questions. I attached the excerpts. I summarized the timeline of notices. I included the exact language from the agenda item. Evidence prop number 3, an agenda excerpt with a vague title that hid a power shift. My neighbor offered to come with me, not as a shield, but as a witness. He also said something that stuck with me. He reminded me that boards like this rely on isolation. They count on residents feeling alone, too intimidated to show up, too unsure to speak. So we built a coalition. Not a protest. A presence. A small group of homeowners agreed to attend the meeting, sit quietly, and listen. Some of them weren't even sure they wanted to speak. They just wanted to be there, because the board president's biggest weapon was the empty room. The night before the meeting, I received an email from the HOA that finally felt like an answer, and it made my stomach twist. It didn't cite a rule. It cited board discretion. It implied that refusing would be treated as a violation. It suggested the board could authorize entry if they deemed it necessary to enforce standards. Authorize entry. Those words mattered. Because they weren't saying they already had the right. They were saying they wanted to vote themselves the right. They wanted to manufacture authority by declaring it. And they wanted to do it before the vote. I sat in the dark living room for a long time after reading it, staring at my own reflection in the window. I could feel the pressure, the social shame they were trying to create, the idea that I'd be labeled difficult, suspicious, uncooperative. I wasn't any of those things. I was just unwilling to let a board president treat my front door like a suggestion. The second rehook hit hard because it wasn't about my paperwork anymore. It was about what happens when an HOA decides your home is theirs, and how quickly that kind of control spreads once it's normalized. The meeting day arrived, and I walked in with my folder held tight, my notes organized, my breathing steady. The board president sat at the front, composed and smug, as if the outcome was already decided. She didn't look at me like a person. She looked at me like an item on the agenda. When the access and enforcement item came up, She leaned into it with a smooth confidence that made my skin crawl. She framed it as a simple update, a way to protect the community, a tool to ensure compliance. The kind of language that sounds reasonable until you realize it's aimed like a weapon. I waited until the moment for homeowner comments, and then I stood. I kept my voice calm. I didn't accuse her of bullying, even though she was. I didn't call the HOA corrupt, even though it felt like it. I simply asked the board to identify the governing document section that allowed interior entry, explain how board discretion overrode published policy, and clarify whether the proposed update would apply to current disputes. I referenced my printed excerpts without theatrics. I held up the agenda excerpt and the notice language. I offered to submit copies for the record. For the first time since this began, the board president's expression flickered. Not panic. Not fear. Just that split-second recalculation of someone realizing the target brought receipts. She tried to move on quickly, to treat my questions like noise, to call it handled privately. But the room wasn't empty. The neighbors were there. They watched. They listened. They shifted in their seats in a way that made the board president aware she wasn't performing for a vacuum. Then my neighbor stood too, steady and quiet, and asked a simple question about procedure, about notice requirements, about whether the board could create new powers without community approval. The board president's jaw tightened. And that's when she made her biggest mistake. Instead of answering, she pushed for an immediate decision, trying to force the update through while the room was still catching up, trying to get it done before the vote could become a real fight. The motion moved faster than it should have. Papers shuffled. The board president's pen hovered like she couldn't wait to sign something. And right as the board prepared to finalize it, someone at the front produced a new document I hadn't seen in the shared materials, something labeled as an authorization for enforcement access. My stomach dropped as the paper slid into view, because it looked like the kind of thing they could use to justify showing up at my door. I gripped my folder, felt the edges of the highlighted pages under my fingers, and realized the cliffhanger truth. They weren't threatening to enter my home anymore. They were preparing to authorize it. The room went quiet in that strange way meetings do when people sense something important just happened but don't yet understand the details. I watched the board president's hand linger near the new document, and I could feel the pivot in the air, like she was about to turn a procedural trick into a personal victory. My heart was pounding, but my brain was strangely clear. This wasn't a surprise policy update. This was a custom-built tool, created in real time, designed to make my refusal look like defiance. It was retaliation wearing a suit. I didn't lunge forward. I didn't raise my voice. I did the only thing that works against people who count on you losing control. I asked for the document to be read into the record and provided to homeowners. The board president didn't like that. Her smile tightened, and she tried to summarize it quickly, in a way that made it sound routine. But she couldn't explain it without admitting it changed the rules. I watched a couple of homeowners exchange glances. That was the crack. That was the moment the board president lost her grip on the narrative, even if she didn't know it yet. I asked a second question, equally calm. Had this authorization been distributed in advance as part of the agenda packet, or was it being introduced now? Her response was evasive, and in that evasion, the room found its footing. My neighbor didn't argue with her. He simply referenced the meeting notice requirements everyone had received and asked whether a late added enforcement authorization was even valid for a decision. It wasn't a dramatic confrontation. It was a procedural trap, and the board president walked right into it because she assumed no one would challenge her at that level. But the coalition was there. The empty room strategy wasn't available anymore. Someone behind me murmured that they hadn't seen that document. Another person asked if this meant the HOA could enter homes anytime they wanted. The board president tried to reassure them while still pushing for the decision, but reassurance doesn't work when people realize the scope of what's being proposed. That's when she switched tactics. She tried to make me the villain. Not directly, not with name-calling. She framed it as one homeowner refusing to comply, forcing the board to take stronger measures to protect the community. The implication was obvious. If I hadn't been difficult, none of this would be necessary. I felt the heat of social shame crawl up my neck, the same pressure the HOA had been cultivating with every notice. But I stayed still, because I wasn't going to be baited into becoming her proof. The rehook landed without effort, because the room could finally see what this was. If they could rush a new authority through right now, before the vote, then any homeowner could be next, and the power imbalance would become permanent. I raised my folder slightly, not as a weapon, but as a reminder that this wasn't a he said she said situation. I referenced the governing document excerpt again. I referenced the HOA's published policy about inspection scope. I referenced the escalating notices with their shifting language. I asked, plainly, how an authorization to enter private homes aligned with what homeowners were promised when they moved in. The board president tried to redirect, but she was losing control of the room, and she could feel it. She called the issue sensitive, suggested it should be handled privately, and then tried to move the board into a quick vote on the authorization and the policy update in one sweep. That's when I used the most underappreciated tool in any HOA fight. I asked for a postponement. Not because I was scared. Because the board was out of compliance with its own process. I pointed out that homeowners hadn't been given the full materials in advance. I asked whether the board would be willing to delay a decision until the document could be reviewed publicly. I didn't demand. I requested, like a person who believed the rules mattered. The coalition shifted again, and the board president's eyes flicked to the room. For a moment, she hesitated. Then she did what she always did when challenged. She retaliated. The meeting ended with no clear resolution, but the tone had changed, and she hated that. I knew she hated it because she didn't come after me in the meeting. She saved it for later, where she thought she could isolate me again. The next morning, another notice appeared. This one was a final opportunity to cooperate, heavier with implied consequences, still vague enough to avoid citing anything concrete. It reiterated the inspection demand, implied authorization was imminent, and hinted that refusal would lead to enforcement action that could impact standing in the community. I took a photo of it the moment I saw it, then another with the envelope and the date visible on the letterhead. Evidence prop number 4, because by this point the paper trail was the story. Then, the board president escalated the petty. A public-facing community update went out, carefully worded, pretending not to mention me while describing a recent compliance issue and praising the board's commitment to protecting standards. It was the kind of message that makes people glance at their neighbors' houses and wonder who the problem is. I felt the flush of humiliation even though no one had said my name. That was the point. But humiliation is only effective when the target stays silent. I didn't. I responded the way I had from the beginning. Calm. Written. Documented. I asked again for the specific authority for entry. I asked again for the inspection scope. I asked again for the policy draft and whether it would be applied retroactively. And I added one more question, the kind that makes bullies cautious. I asked for confirmation that the HOA would not attempt entry without my express permission. There it was. A simple sentence that forced them to choose between admitting their overreach or writing down an intention that would look terrible later. My neighbor advised me to send it the same way as before, so there was no claim it got lost. I did. Then I did the second part of the strategy. I took the story out of the shadows. I didn't broadcast it like gossip. I didn't attack anyone personally. I simply shared the documents with the coalition homeowners who had shown up at the meeting, along with the governing excerpt and the published inspection policy. I asked them to read it and decide for themselves whether the board's actions matched the rules. People are hesitant when they're asked to choose sides. They're less hesitant when they're shown paper. The responses came back quietly, in driveways and on walks, in the form of nods and short comments that carried weight. People didn't like the idea of entry demands. People didn't like vague threats. People didn't like last-minute documents at meetings. And people especially didn't like feeling manipulated right before the vote. The board president sensed the shift, and she doubled down. A third notice arrived, this one attempting to narrow the demand into something that sounded more reasonable. It claimed they only needed brief access to verify a reported condition. Reported by whom? It didn't say. What condition? It didn't say. It was a strategic rebrand, meant to make me look irrational for resisting. I almost laughed at the audacity, but it wasn't funny. It was calculated. So I made my response even more precise. I stated that I was willing to address any exterior or common area concerns consistent with the published policy. I stated that I would not consent to interior entry without a documented basis. I offered a written alternative, such as providing photos of relevant exterior areas if they could identify what they claimed to be enforcing. I didn't frame it as defiance. I framed it as cooperation within boundaries. That's when the board president tried a new angle, and it was the one that finally pushed my patience to the edge. She showed up. Not inside my home, not on my porch, but in the most theatrical place possible, near the walkway where people could see. She stood with her phone out, as if she were documenting something for enforcement, as if she were a professional doing official work, as if the neighborhood was her stage again. I felt that crawling sensation of being watched, the same one that made this feel like a Karen neighbor drama unfolding in real time. She wasn't just enforcing rules. She was performing authority. I didn't give her the reaction she wanted. I walked past my window, then sat down at my table and opened my folder again. I updated my notes. I wrote down what I saw, when I saw it, and how long it lasted. I didn't need to confront her to win. I needed to outlast her tactics. The coalition's plan wasn't to fight her in the street. It was to box her in at the process level, where her performance would fall apart. The day of the vote arrived, and the tension felt like static in the air. It wasn't just my situation anymore. Homeowners had been talking, quietly, in the way people do when they don't want to be targeted but can't ignore something unsettling. The meeting room filled more than usual. The board president's posture was tight, still polished, but there was an edge to her movements. She had expected to glide into this vote with the authority item tucked neatly into place. Instead, she was facing an audience. When the agenda moved to the access and enforcement item, she tried to control the framing again. She emphasized safety. She emphasized standards. She implied the board needed tools to act quickly. And then she tried to bring up my case as an example. Again, not naming me directly, but making it obvious. She referenced a refusal and a lack of cooperation, and I could feel heads in the room turning slightly, trying to identify the story's main character. I stood when it was time for homeowner comments, and I spoke without emotion. I summarized the timeline of notices and questions. I noted the lack of cited authority. I referenced the governing excerpt and the HOA's own published inspection policy. I stated that I had repeatedly asked for clarity and had offered cooperation within scope. I asked the board to confirm, on the record, whether they believed they could authorize entry into private homes without express consent. I didn't need to attack. I needed to make them answer. My neighbor stood after me, and he did what he did best. He focused on process. He asked whether the late added authorization document from the prior meeting had been distributed in advance this time. He asked whether homeowners had been given an opportunity to review it. He asked whether the board could adopt such a change without broader approval. The board president tried to cut him off, but the room didn't let it happen. Someone asked to see the document. Someone else asked whether this applied to everyone. Another homeowner asked why this was happening now. It turned into a slow, steady unraveling of the board president's control. And that's when the satisfying part began, not as a sudden twist, but as the earned result of keeping records and building a coalition. A homeowner from the coalition requested that the meeting follow the existing procedures for policy changes and that any expansion of enforcement powers be delayed for proper notice and community review. It wasn't grandstanding. It was basic fairness. The board president tried to push forward anyway, but now every move she made looked like a power grab, because it was. She attempted to call for the vote quickly, but the attention was on the process. She attempted to reframe the issue as routine, but routine doesn't require secrecy. She attempted to imply that questioning the board was undermining the community, but the community was right there, watching her undermine it. The final push came when she was asked, directly, to cite the governing document authority for interior entry. She couldn't. Not in a way that matched the language she'd been using in notices. That moment wasn't a shouted victory. It was a quiet collapse of credibility. The kind of collapse that doesn't need drama because it's obvious to everyone in the room. The board backed off the authorization. They didn't admit wrongdoing. They didn't apologize. They simply shifted into procedural retreat, proposing to table the item and revisit it later with proper distribution of materials. It wasn't everything, but it was the thing that mattered. They were no longer poised to force entry before the vote. After the meeting, the board president avoided direct contact. Her public updates got colder, more generic, less personal. The performative authority became harder to sustain when people started asking for documents. And then, in the days that followed, the notices stopped. Not because she suddenly became kind, but because my house was no longer an easy target. The paper trail existed. The coalition existed. The room wasn't empty anymore. I kept my folder anyway. I kept my photos. I kept the printed excerpts. Because the lesson of an HOA revenge story isn't that you win once and you're safe forever. The lesson is that the only antidote to petty power is steady accountability. The aftershock was subtle but real. Neighbors started attending meetings more often. People asked for agenda packets earlier. People discussed policies like they belonged to them, not the board president. As for me, I didn't feel triumphant the way movies make it look. I felt relieved. I felt grounded. I felt like my home was mine again. And I felt something else too. I felt proud that I hadn't let them bait me into becoming the problem they wanted me to be. If you've ever dealt with HOA fines gone wrong, you know the pressure isn't just about rules. It's about making you feel small. It's about isolating you until you comply out of exhaustion. I didn't comply out of exhaustion. I complied with the actual rules, and I refused the rest. Thanks for sticking with me through this satisfying revenge story, and if you want more of these, please like, share, subscribe, turn on notifications, comment your HOA experience below, and thanks for watching. Now, the part that still makes my skin prickle is what happened afterward, because the board president didn't disappear. She just got quieter, and quiet doesn't always mean harmless. It means planning. It means waiting for the next opening, the next procedural corner to hide behind. I started noticing small shifts in meeting notices, subtle changes in wording, tiny additions that looked boring until you remembered how the last attempt happened. I kept showing up. I kept asking for documents. My neighbor kept his folder ready. The coalition didn't dissolve, because once people see the pattern, they can't unsee it. And the board president, for all her polish and control, couldn't stand the fact that the room was no longer hers alone. So when the next agenda came out with a new community standards clarification item tucked near the bottom, I felt that old familiar static creep back in, and I realized this wasn't over, it was just evolving.